Greetings, everyone. I have decided to share with you across the next few weeks the interviews that I did as part of the Healing Summit, Healing Ourselves, Healing Our World, that was associated with the launch of the book From Trauma to Freedom, One Woman's Journey and a Holistic Guide for Healing, that I co-authored with Christina Lee. This book is really a soul offering from both of us to support others in their journeys of healing and transformation. And these people that I interviewed from all different parts of the world are people that I have profound respect for, who are doing healing work in their own unique and creative ways, and who are also on their own paths of healing. In this first interview, I interview someone who's become very dear to me and who I have deep respect for, Lynna Chandra, who lives in Singapore and has founded the first palliative care program for children in Indonesia. She's continuing to oversee that program and work with the staff. As you can imagine, now in the midst of the COVID crisis, the intensification of the pressures on these people who are bringing compassionate care to children and families in Indonesia. I did this interview with Lynna in March of this past year, 2021, and want to share with you her insights on her own transformation from being an investment banker to becoming so deeply involved with this palliative care program in Indonesia, and her own vision for bringing compassion and humanity back into medical care around the globe. I think her vision is profound and is timely as we're dealing with this time of transition and transformation, individually and globally. I would encourage you to watch this interview and consider supporting her program, Rachel House, in Indonesia. The website is rachelhouse.org, and consider supporting them in their work as they are supporting children and families in need in Indonesia. Thank you. All right, well, welcome everyone to our Healing Summit, Healing Ourselves, Healing Our World. And I'm very excited today to have a chance to talk to Lynna Chandra, who I've known now for about a year and have just such incredible respect for who you are and for the work that you're doing. But let me just give a little bit of background about you for everyone. So you were in investment banking for over a decade and then made a significant shift and ended up founding the first children's palliative care service in Indonesia in 2006, Rachel House. And what's amazing is that this provides in-home services to children from marginalized communities, children living with cancer and HIV/AIDS. And it's extraordinary how you've supported the way this is structured so that the children and families are able to be the primary decision makers about what care they need, and then have nurses who come and really assist them in the palliative care that they need. It's also amazing that you've now also embarked on a new vision and mission to bring humanity back into medicine and to really try to make sure that equitable, humane services for healthcare are provided and available for all. In addition to all of this, Lynna is an Ashoka Fellow and an Atlantic Fellow and serves on the boards of Assisi Hospice in Singapore, Bamboo Capital Management, and Common Purpose Charitable Trust. And you're now based in Singapore. So thank you for doing this today. And I'd love to start by just asking how you made that shift from investment banking to being involved in hospice work.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for this honor to be part of this summit. I think it's a great question as to how I made that switch. In our conversation, I've often highlighted the fact that life is a perfect curation, looking backwards. At the point when I was making the shift, I didn't know that I was embarking on this incredible journey that completely transformed my life. Looking back now, 15 years since I started Rachel House. When the triggering point was my friend Rachel's death. And prior to that, the journey of caring for her during the last year or so, with her journey through the last 12 years. She had 12 years of cancer. And Rachel was an amazing woman who never allowed her illness to cripple her or affect her just exuberance in life. In that sense also, she never acknowledged death. Her exuberance in life meant that there were a lot of friends always around her who supported her. Her refusal to acknowledge death also meant that she was always caring for others, even though she had been through hours of chemotherapy. And it was just a sheer refusal to acknowledge that and defeat. I learned a lot from her during her last days. But more than anything else, I also observed that Rachel was incredibly blessed with resources. She came from a very, very wealthy family. And the question that was constantly in my mind during her care and also after her death was, what would happen? What happened to people if they didn't have the resources that Rachel had? And that question, for some reason or other, kept plaguing my mind. I was in my early 30s or mid 30s. And I started researching, doing desktop research on what happens to people if they didn't have money. For some reason or other, I veered towards children. And I read horrendous stuff, but one story that stuck in my mind was of these two boys living with HIV and in Thailand. And their parents had died and they were sleeping on this dirt floor in a family home. Their extended family was looking after them, but they were all out. And the younger boy started vomiting and the older brother struggled up, found a cloth, cleaned him up, and then promptly just tumbled back on the floor and too tired to do anything else. And I thought to myself at that time, innocently, how could children be left on their own? Surely this is not possible. That article drove me to then travel through Thailand to look at where children with HIV would live and how they would be taken care of. And then I traveled to India, already on track to look at more at people living with HIV, and understanding that that would be the most discriminated, the most isolated and marginalized group. And then to Indonesia and to look at the hospital setting. The last scene in Indonesia really broke my heart. And it's also the country that I was born in Indonesia, and for much of my investment banking career, that's the country that I worked and had contributed mostly to my education during my time in investment bank, to also my productivity, in terms of my income. And so, but what I saw in the hospital really, I think, haunted me for many months. It was the largest hospital in Indonesia, a ward, and luckily that ward had been basically completely torn down and rebuilt. And it was a ward of 40 beds on each side of completely just screaming children. Mm-hmm. And when I walked in there, I couldn't believe it was just this noise. It was like hell on earth. Mm. And I looked around at all of these rusty beds, iron rusty beds and rusty windows, and children just all screaming. And one child in particular with an icy bowl of water and his finger dipped inside, and his mother kept saying, "Patient, child, patient." And I asked the doctor, "Why are they all screaming?" And she said, "Painkillers are expensive." And I said, "How expensive are painkillers?" And she said, "About $10 a shot." As an ex-investment banker, I thought, $10 a shot, I can do that. And so I started going through, well, if I could build 60 beds hospice, I could have all of these children come in. And you see the lack of understanding then, hospice, and these children may still be undergoing curative treatment, but for me at that time, the simplicity of $10 a shot, and I could build somewhere where the children could go to with their families, and they didn't have to worry about food. They didn't have to worry about pain. I could hire people and doctors and nurses to just make sure that these children would be okay. That was a simple idea. And that idea was the triggering point for me to enter this world. I thought I would I committed to 1 year of my life, Heather.
Wow.
And for 1 year, I would build the hospice, and then I would return it and gift it to the people in Indonesia, and then I would go back to my happy life. So that was the point of shift.
Well, and it's extraordinary to hear that this was all coming from your compassion to make a difference for these children and families that were really suffering.
Yeah, that's a way to look at it. The quote that I often walk with when I first started was a quote, I think, by John Wolfgang Goethe. It says something like, if you had a dream, whenever you do whatever you do or dream you can, start it or begin it. Boldness has courage. Boldness has power and magic in it. And I used to think I'm bold or courageous, and I know I can do this. And if power and magic can be my partner, then it will be done. But you're right, it's the screaming of the child that I think, and that continued to motivate me throughout. the journey, because many times I was very tempted to give up.
Well, and you started with this one vision in mind, but then it really morphed, didn't it?
Yeah.
Because you ended up really structuring a very different paradigm for supporting these children and families by shifting from a hospital setting to in-home care that was really organized. That's what's remarkable to me. The whole paradigm was based on what is really going to be the most compassionate way to be of service and support these children and families.
Yeah, a lesson in humility. And really, once again, looking back, perfectly curated lesson for me. I don't think I would, had I known at that time that we would convert to home care, I don't think I would have started on the journey. My training and everything taught me structure was a solution. And pouring down money and structure would solve anything and everything, all the problems. What I learned along the journey as doors continued to close and we couldn't find a place to pilot our first hospice. And then we finally had to pilot in a small 3-bed hospital, 3rd-class ward. And children didn't come. We had 9 children who agreed to come to spend their last days in the 3-bed ward. When all of those challenges were presented, and I couldn't find any other way. I remember having a chat with the universe and say, okay, I'm done. You do it. And I could literally imagine all doors close. And at that moment, really down on my knees, I said, I'm done. You know, we're in 2009. We started embarking on this journey in 2006 and 2009. We finally managed to get a place, but then, you know, in 18 months, only 9 children agreed to come. And at that time, at that moment when I said I'm done, I could feel energetically that doors began to open. And that more than anything else, the doorway to my heart opened. I learned to listen. The nurses kept telling me that they needed to do home care, that children were at home, that children, after all of the chemotherapy, all the treatment, really wanted to be home. But I kept saying to myself, I didn't embark on this journey to do home care. And you know, besides, we had purchased the land, we were drawing, and the drawings were almost done, and we had put in the application to start building. And all of the train had started on that. And I couldn't see the shift being possible. But once again, it was the limitation. I was seeing through a pinhole of what all the training, all that I had, all my upbringing had taught me to see through. And so one day I put out the vote to all of the nurses, and I said, okay, put up your hand for everyone who wanted to do home care. And that was lined up. I said, home care is going to be really tough, and you're going to be on your motorbikes. It's going to be really hot, and you're going to be venturing into really dangerous areas, because at that time, HIV was mainly in a population of drug users, and needle exchange caused, transmission. And having lined up the scene, I said, okay, now let's vote. Everyone put up their hands for home care. I was the only one. Still on track to build.
Amazing.
And so that began the change, because I gave them 6 months and then another 6 months to try out the home care. And we never looked back since. That lesson taught me how to listen. And again, I was trained after that until I really understand the humility of not knowing, the understanding that I really didn't know. I had the compassion, or I had the determination to make sure that the children didn't have to cry out in pain. Because our vision when we first started was no child should ever have to live or die. No child should ever have to die in pain, unloved and uncared for.
Beautiful.
Today, our vision is no child should ever have to live or die in pain. We took away the word unloved because a parent, once again, this taught me how to listen, came to me and said, my child was never uncared for and unloved. And, because you had that in your vision, I found it really difficult initially to call on Rachel House.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this whole process, this whole journey was a transformational journey for you, as well as your being so instrumental in providing these services for others.
Yeah, I think I've learned that it is impossible, or it's not possible, to do this work without opening yourself up to the lessons that your soul needs to learn. I mean, watching the devastation in children's lives, in families' lives, breaks any heart. And in that moment of breaking, it's that opportunity to learn. And learn both the limitations or the judgment or the perceptions that you have built that limits you from opening up. And as you break, you have the opportunity to break into something more expansive, or you can break into the fear of having to go through this heartbreak ever again and therefore close up. And I think it's a choice that we're given whenever crisis happens in our lives, that you can choose to grow through the pain and be the greater or the more expansive person that you can grow into, or you've been born into, or you can shut down and once again protect yourself so that you never have to go through that pain again.
Oh, it's beautifully said. I think it's Rumi that says the wound is the crack through which the light can come through and enlighten us and transform us and guide us in our own healing journey, but then how we can be healing and compassionate to others.
So true. Yeah.
So how did this then eventually morph into this new vision that you have for bringing humanity back into medicine?
If we look at Rachel House's journey, from hospice or structure to home care, there was a child who eventually, not only did the nurses do the voting, but there was a child who eventually taught me that this was going to be the way, the home care. This boy, we had a driver, took him from the hospital that he was being discharged from the oncology ward, and where he had been receiving a lot of the chemotherapy treatment for over 18 months. And we tried to convince him to come into our 3-bedder. We showed him the toys, we showed him the games, we showed him our nurses were really dressed in child-friendly outfit. There was going to be no injections and he was not going to be in pain. There was a garden outside, and he said he wanted to go home. And I couldn't believe it. So when our nurses went to take care of him in his home, I decided to find out why would he want to go home. And he said, well, home is where my grandmother's cooking, the smell of my grandmother's cooking is. Home is where the children could come through the door, my friends that I hadn't seen for a long time, they could just walk through the door because our doors are always open. And he went home to sleep in the middle of the house because the house is so small. So his bed was on the floor and in the middle of the living room. In a way, he was the center of everything. And when he went home, he said, there is a movie that was just showing in the theater at that time. It's called Laskar Pelangi, that all the children wanted to see. And he said, can you take me to the theater? And I wanted to see this show. Well, of course he couldn't go because he had this huge wound at the base of his spine, and he couldn't even sit. So we happen to know one of our donors who actually partly funded that movie. So we asked them if they could call the producer and to see if the movie could be brought into the child's home, because we couldn't buy the DVD at that time. It was still showing in the cinema. And so a screen was put up in this little home.
Right.
And the movie was shown, and there were kids on the floor all watching it with him. And pure joy. And that was when I realized that the stories that these children tell, they're the stories that need to guide us in what we do. Because we've set up the service not so much so that we could do the best, the center of excellence of palliative care in Indonesia. But more importantly is to listen to what they need, what the children need, what their families need, and let them guide us. And so what he taught us, Fajar taught me, was that we need to continuously be flexible enough so that our journey is guided not so much by a perception of what I thought the service needed to be, but that the ground up stories need to guide us in what is needed. So that was the beginning of the shift to home care and a children palliative care service. Then in 2013, a man who had been serving coffee to our team, we call him the office boy, even though he was not a boy, he was in his 40s, but the most gentle soul and the kindest and the most giving soul. He was diagnosed with liver cancer. And the process of his treatment and throughout the process of his last days, we realized that whatever we had learned from 2006 to 2013, didn't prepare us to look after him, didn't prepare us to advocate for him through the hospital. And when he died, I remember all of us coming together and said, this is not the place to rest. We need to evolve. I tried to speak to our board and ask if we could evolve to something that would embrace also the service for the adult. They said, no, you were set up for children. Stay true to the children's service. And they did, however, give us the approval to train at a wider level beyond just children's service. So we started going into providing training of palliative care to adult wards, to adult services. And that brought us to a much larger ambit, much larger scene of how do we train services around Indonesia and give a model of care that we know would ensure that people's pain are alleviated, even when treatment is no longer possible, that the last days of a person's life do not leave behind trauma for their family. And remember, we're in a country where healthcare services are still often inundated and overwhelmed. And so treatment, curative treatment, often is not available to many people, or many who come from the rural area would have come in too late for curative treatment to really work. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be afforded compassionate care to alleviate their symptoms, and so that they could live with optimal quality of life during their last days. And that was when I realized, when I look at how we provide care for our children and what was missing for a lot of the people in the adult ward, that it is not money. Money is an important tool, but money alone is not the criteria. It's not just clinical skills. And that alone will not allow us to alleviate a lot of the suffering on someone's last journey. But it is the willingness to see with your heart, the willingness to face suffering in its most devastating way and still continue to be present. The courage to walk beside a family, a patient in their last days, when you know often that you have limited resources to help them, but by just being present and the willingness to hold somebody's hands through the last days, that is a critical component to alleviate suffering. We call it a companionship for a lot of the mothers, the single mothers looking after the children. And just by being there, being available at the end of a call, at the end of a phone, 24 hours, during the time when their children are at their last stages, being available for them to call at any time and say, I'm really panicking, I don't know what to do, he's bleeding all over, do I stay, what do I do? Just being available. Breathing with, just last week, a 17-year-old was dying. And every night at 10:30 or 11, he needed to call our nurse. He needed to just breathe because he suffered from a lot of just cancer had gone to his lungs. And yes, he had his oxygen tank, but that really didn't alleviate much. Yes, he had morphine, but he also wanted to stay awake. So he was adamant that he didn't take too high a level or dose of morphine that would put him to sleep. He wanted to be awake for the last part of his life and also to be awake to his family. So the breathing with our nurse at that nighttime is often the hardest time for a lot of our children. And our nurse was at the other end of the call, making sure that he was calm enough and listening to him breathing until he was calm enough to play his game on his telephone.
Wow.
And I think that is the lesson that takes me to my next journey of my commitment to bring compassion and humanity back to medicine. Because I've seen in the last, as a layperson and not a trained medical professional, I've seen how science, clinical excellence often takes precedence over the soft side, the soft skills of heart, compassion, bearing witness of another's journey. In fact, many doctors talk about the inability to even acknowledge when they feel sad that their patient has died, that there is no room to stop to even honor that brief relationship that they've had with this patient. They just have to sign the death certificate and leave the room because there are other patients that need them. I believe that the medical business is run very differently from other hospitality business.
Mm-hmm.
It is meant to be a consumer-centric service, a patient-centric service. But instead, it has been run to the contrary. And I think I jokingly often say it's probably one of the least consumer-driven service I've seen. It's more of a system-driven. We don't have enough time, therefore doctors can only see patients 7 minutes per patient. And yet many doctors in their hearts die because they know in that 7 minutes, you don't even have time to allow your patient to just relax into being able to tell the full story behind their pain, their symptoms.
And you're describing so vividly how it becomes a toxic system then for not only the patients, the people being treated, but the physicians and nurses, the medical staff. Everyone then is in service to the system rather than it being really in service to the people. And the other piece that I think you're talking about, Lynna, that is so profound is the difference between treatment and healing. And we can have, technology and medicines and all of these aspects of our care, but that at the deepest level, what is so profoundly healing for people is to feel seen and heard and held with compassion. And that whatever we're dealing with, wherever we are on that journey, it is mind, body, spirit, not just the physicality of what's needing to be addressed. And you're really creating a program with Rachel House that's attuned to that. And it seems like you're seeing the larger paradigm that needs to shift with healthcare on a larger scale.
Yeah, Heather, healing is such a powerful word, and thank you for bringing that in, because I often wonder, why is it palliating emotionally, physically, and spiritually that is the anchor of palliative care? Why is it that it only exists for patients at the end of life when it should be throughout the course of an illness? Because being seen, as you said, is so important. I learned from my mentor in the early stage of my journey in palliative care. Dr. Rosalie Shaw used to sit till late into the night with some of her patients. It's the end of the day at around 5 o'clock. She would go into the ward and she would make sure that everyone is all right, supposedly just around to make sure everyone is okay before she goes home. But often she would sit until 8 p.m., until late into the night, with one particular patient who really needed to talk. And now she's an Australian doctor in Singapore, and sometimes her patient could hardly speak English. But there would be this incredible exchange and stories being told in broken English. And I would wait for her because, I had organized a dinner with her, wanting to learn more. And then I would wait outside and I say, what's going on there? She said, this mother and, this woman in her 60s never told some of these stories to anyone else, but felt the need to tell her stories to someone. And she just needed to tell some of her deep, dark secrets or her sorrows or her feeling of that life had passed her by. And she had missed out on the opportunity to live the life that she had dreamt of as a little girl. And Rosalie allowed them to let go of that baggage in the final journey of their lives. And what a relief. And I often think, why is it that this ability to be seen and knowing that the need to be seen is part of healing, and that an illness is not just at a physical level, but more importantly, a lot of what we're suffering from comes out and manifests itself in physical form because of the emotional hurt that we have not dealt with. And the ability to just come up and let go of that baggage that we have carried along the way, it's such a privilege, it's such an honor that I think we have not acknowledged, and definitely our medical service has not trained the medical professional to have the privilege and the honor to do. The impact of that is a toxic system. We hear about internal fights, internal battle between medical teams. When I first started and our nurses started fighting among themselves, and people in the medical world just say nurses are like chicken in Australian terms. Nurses are like chooks, they will always fight. But it's not true, because as we hold the space for our nurses to talk about the way their hearts break, their fear of failure whenever a child dies, their fear of not having done enough for the family, and the ability to just talk about that, allow them to just fall into the greater self, fall into the softness that is within them, that they're able to carry one another, to hold one another. And so I often say, how can we expect our doctors and nurses to care for our patients if we don't care for them?
Oh, beautifully said. Yes. You know, when I was a clinical director of a local agency overseeing 70 clinical staff therapists, that was exactly, I really restructured the way our clinic was functioning with that whole notion. If we don't care for our staff and respect them and listen to them and be there for them, how do we expect them to be there in that healing way for the patients who come to the clinic? And that's exactly what you're describing. And when you really create that context of compassion and respect and care, it then emanates out.
Yeah.
Rather than people being burnt out.
Exactly. This burnout thing, we keep trying to sort of say, okay, we have to find a way to stop the burnout, but come back to the source. The source of burnout is the inability to speak about what hurts you, not being able to feel safe
in the process, to feel supported and cared for.
Right. And not being given the safe space to talk about what hurts, and the need to honor, or the feeling that, how can I work in an organization that doesn't honor death when we're supposed to be dealing in life and death and caring? And the ability to be able to talk about what is troubling you with your family. Because if you can't talk about that, if there is no space at work to talk about what's worrying you at work, at home, then when somebody performs less than their normal self, we put it down to, oh, they're just not performing, instead of saying what's going on at home. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's that holistic way. If we expect our team to look after our patients in the entire self in a holistic way, then let's make sure we also take care of them in their total self. And their family is a huge part of that. Their feelings is a huge part of that.
This is extraordinary, Lynna. I mean, it's really creating a whole new paradigm shift for what healthcare would look like, and really shifting it into a healing model for everyone involved. And this is profound. What an amazing, bold, and compassionate vision.
And you've heard this from me before, Heather. If I have another 20 years of this life, if we could all die witnessing a transformation in healthcare, then I think I would die a happy person.
Well, and what's amazing is as that paradigm shifts, it's as you well know with all of your experience and expertise and background, it's going to create paradigm shifts in every system of our global community, so that healthcare, it will shift how we operate in our economies. It will shift how we operate in our political systems and in our educational and training systems. So it's really, as we can, wherever we each can make that influence, be shifting these paradigms into more healing, equitable, respectful paradigms, it will continue to shift the consciousness of the planet.
And, this is the ripple effect, right, of what we envision ourselves, and we create the world that we want to see. And as we create the microcosm of Rachel House, and we're seeing wonderful, collegiate, compassionate, and loving way that our team is working with one another. And even as they leave us, and ultimately people leave an organization, we wish them always the ability to create their own compassionate environment wherever they go. And that what they've seen in our community at Rachel House, they will replicate that wherever they go. And this is our next dream at Rachel House, where we're codifying our process and hoping that every nurse who leave us and who may go back to their hometown in a rural area will be given the opportunity to start something similar, but now with a playbook, with a rule book on how to start it, and hopefully eventually with the funding to survive for the first 6 to 12 months, so they don't have to worry who's going to pay them, how are they going to survive, but given the courage to just start something similar, because that will propel
Absolutely.
this whole ripple effect.
Will shift. Oh, Lynna, this is so beautiful. Well, as we bring this interview to an end, if people want to support Rachel House and this work that you're doing, give us the website or the link that people can either donate money to support this program or volunteer their services.
Our website address is rachel-house.org. And you'll be able, or if you just Google Rachel House Indonesia, you should be able to find Rachel House. And there is a Section 501c3 site that we have subscribed to, that for people from America will be able to donate through. And that's a global giving site. And once again, the address is on our website under the donation link. And as we talk about volunteering, Heather, Rachel House is where we are today because of the amazing people, amazing souls who have actually volunteered with us. We used to rely on a lot of some of the teachings from Cincinnati Children's Hospital, from the team there. They used to travel to Indonesia about 3 times a year to help train not only our team, but also doctors and nurses from other hospitals. And now with the ability to Zoom, we are hosting a lot of lecture series for international speakers, international experts to contribute their skills and their knowledge to, once again, not only our team, but also doctors and nurses throughout Indonesia. So we would welcome any of these wonderful experts, or even people who are willing to just volunteer with Rachel House.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this summit and for the amazing work that you're doing, Lynna, both in daring to allow your heart to break open and be transformed by your being present with the people that you were seeing suffering and in need, and the way in which your work now is really helping to transform the paradigms that we're living in, to move in a direction that's more compassionate and healing. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for this opportunity.